What happens when two legends of the silver screen, tethered by a grudge older than most of their fans, face off under the glare of live television? The air crackled with unease that night in 2025, as the Hollywood Spotlight chat show welcomed Clint Eastwood and Harrison Ford. The stage gleamed, all gold trim and velvet chairs, with a live audience buzzing in their seats. The host, Jack Reynolds, flashed a toothy grin, unaware of the storm brewing. Clint, at 95, sat with a smirk, his eyes sharp as ever, exuding the confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. Harrison, 72, leaned back, his smile tight, hands clenched on his lap. You could feel the weight of something unspoken, like a rope stretched too tight between them. Jack kicked things off with easy chatter, praising Clint's decades of directing grit and Harrison's charm as Indiana Jones. The crowd clapped, but the two men barely glanced at each other. Then Jack, fishing for nostalgia, brought up a 1970s Western Desert Vengeance, a film Clint directed and starred in. He called it a classic, a turning point for the genre. Clint nodded, soaking up the praise, while Harrison's jaw tightened. Jack, oblivious, pressed on, asking if they had any fun memories from that era. The question landed like a spark in dry grass. Clint leaned forward, his voice low and gravelly. He said the film was a gamble that paid off, but only because he made tough calls. Some folks, he added, didn't have the spine for the big leagues back then. His eyes flicked to Harrison, just for a second, but it was enough. The audience shifted, sensing the jab. Harrison's face darkened, his fingers digging into the armrest. He forced a laugh, but it sounded like a growl. He said he remembered Desert Vengeance well, especially the promises that didn't survive the final cut. The crowd murmured, confused but intrigued. Jack, smelling drama, asked what Harrison meant. Harrison leaned in, his voice steady but sharp, like a blade honed over years. He said Clint had offered him a key role in the film, a chance to break out, back when Harrison was just a carpenter, with a few bit parts. He'd prepared for weeks, banked everything on it. But Clint, without a word, gave the part to a bigger name to sell more tickets. Harrison was left scrambling, his dreams kicked to the curb. The betrayal stung, he said, and it shaped every fight he had to win after. Clint snorted loud enough for the microphones to catch. The audience gasped, hanging on every word. He said he didn't recall any promises, just a lot of young actors who thought they were owed a shot. He called Harrison's story a sob tale, the kind losers tell to feel better. The crowd went quiet, stunned by the venom. Jack tried to steer back, stammering about the film's success, but the damage was done. Harrison's eyes burned, his voice low and dangerous. He said he didn't need pity, just truth. And Clint wouldn't know truth, if it bit him. The tension was a living thing now, coiling around the stage. Clint leaned back, his smirk wider, like he'd won a round. He said Harrison should be grateful for the scraps he got, because not everyone could handle the heat of a real career. He waved a hand, dismissing Harrison's whole journey, calling it luck dressed up as talent. The audience booed softly, some shocked, others eating up the clash. Harrison's hands shook, his restraint fraying like an old rope. He stared at Clint, the man who'd nearly broken him decades ago, and you could see the storm building in his chest, ready to burst. Could a single moment unravel the myth of a Hollywood titan? The Hollywood Spotlight stage, once a shrine to glamour, now felt like a battlefield. Harrison Ford, his face carved with years of grit, stared down Clint Eastwood, whose smirk taunted him like a schoolyard bully. The audience, still reeling from Clint's cruel jab about Harrison's lucky career, held their breath. Harrison's voice, when it came, was a low rumble, each word deliberate, like stones dropped into still water. He said Clint might fool the world with his squinting hero act, but some knew the truth. Clint built his throne on broken promises and stolen chances. The crowd gasped, their murmurs swelling. Clint's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping the armrest, but Harrison wasn't done. He leaned forward, his gaze locked on his rival. He said desert vengeance wasn't Clint's triumph, but a graveyard of trust. He named others, actors and crew who'd whispered over the years about Clint's ruthless cuts, his habit of tossing aside anyone who didn't serve his ego. Harrison's voice grew sharper, accusing Clint of directing not just films, but betrayals, leaving young talents to drown while he took the glory. The audience clapped, some cheering Harrison's nerve, their loyalty shifting. Clint's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl that could curdle milk. He shot back, his voice a harsh growl, saying Harrison was digging up old dirt because he couldn't handle being second best. He called Harrison a glorified stuntman, a pretty face who stumbled into stardom while real artists like Clint carved their own paths. The crowd oohed, the insult landing like a slap. Clint didn't stop, his words venomous. He said Harrison's family must be ashamed, watching him whine on live television about a job he wasn't good enough for. The jab at Harrison's kin was a low blow, and the audience hissed, sensing the line crossed. Jack Reynolds, the host, finally jumped in, his voice high and shaky. He tried to pivot, asking about their favorite roles, but it was like shouting into a hurricane. Harrison's face flushed, his hands balling into fists. He said Clint had no right to drag his family into this, that only a coward hid behind cheap shots. He stood, towering over the seated Clint, his voice booming. He called Clint a bully who'd rather crush dreams than face his own flops, like those forgotten films that tanked while Harrison's name lit up marquees. The crowd roared, feeding off the raw fury. Clint rose too, slower, his frame wiry but menacing. The stage lights caught the glint in his eyes, like a predator cornered. He stepped closer, too close, his voice a hiss only Harrison in the front row could hear. He said Harrison should watch his mouth, or he'd regret it more than he did 50 years ago. The audience didn't catch the words, but they saw the shift. The way Clint's hand twitched, as if itching to act. Jack scrambled to his feet, waving, his hands begging for calm, but the air was thick with dread, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then it happened. Clint, his face twisted with rage, shoved a finger into Harrison's chest, hard enough to make him stumble back a step. The crowd gasped, some standing, others shouting. It wasn't a punch, not yet, but it was a challenge, a spark that could ignite the whole stage. Harrison froze, his eyes wide. Not with fear, but with something fiercer, a fury tempered by years of survival. Jack yelled for a commercial break, his voice cracking, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the chaos. The audience was on its feet, torn between shock and thrill, as the two legends stood inches apart, the promise of something worse hanging heavy in the air. How does a man face a bully who's been untouchable for decades? The Hollywood spotlight stage was no longer a place for polite banter. It was a ring, and Clint Eastwood had just thrown the first real blow, his finger jabbing Harrison Ford's chest with enough force to stagger him. The audience, half standing, buzzed with shock, their eyes darting between the two men. Harrison, his balance regained, stood tall, his breath heavy but controlled. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the nervous cough of Jack Reynolds, the host, who clutched his cue cards like a lifeline. But Harrison wasn't retreating. His eyes, burning with a fire forged over years of struggle, fixed on Clint, who stood defiant, daring him to respond. Harrison's voice, when it came, was steady, a thunderclap in the quiet. He said he'd spent 50 years proving Clint wrong, building a career not on lies, but on heart. He turned to the audience, his arms wide, and asked if they knew the real Clint Eastwood, the man who'd crushed dreams to pad his own legend. He spoke of a stuntman on Desert Vengeance, injured and abandoned by Clint's crew to save a few bucks. He named a writer, blackballed after questioning Clint's rewrites. Each story landed like a punch, the crowd nodding, some whispering, as Harrison peeled back the myth to reveal a man who thrived on control, not talent. His words weren't just for Clint. They were for every underdog who'd ever been kicked down. The audience erupted, clapping, some shouting Harrison's name. Clint's face twisted, his hands clenching, as the cheers washed over him like a wave he couldn't stop. He stepped closer, his voice a snarl, telling Harrison to shut his mouth before he made him. The threat was raw, ugly, and the crowd booed, their loyalty now firmly with Harrison. Jack, sweating, tried to interject, babbling about respect for both legends, but his words were drowned out. The stage manager, visible in the wings, signaled frantically to cut to commercial, but the cameras stayed on, capturing the chaos like a documentary of a war. Then Clint snapped. His hand shot out, not a shove this time, but a grip, seizing Harrison's arm with a force that made the crowd gasp. It was the strike everyone would talk about, not a fist, but a clamp, his fingers digging into Harrison's sleeve, pulling him close. Clint's voice was a hiss, saying Harrison would pay for dragging his name through the mud. Harrison didn't flinch, his eyes locked on Clint's, but the audience saw the tension in his frame, the effort to stay calm. The move was bold, reckless, and it lit a fuse in the room. Some spectators yelled for Clint to back off. Others screamed for security, their voices a chaotic chorus. Jack lunged between them, his hands flapping, begging Clint to let go. The crew scrambled, headsets crackling, as producers shouted orders, off stage. But Harrison, still caught in Clint's grip, raised his free hand, silencing the host. He spoke, his voice calm but piercing, saying Clint could hold on all he wanted, but the truth was out, and no grip could bury it. The crowd roared, their cheers shaking the studio. They began to chant, "Harrison! Harrison!" Each syllable, a rebuke to Clint's arrogance. Clint's eyes widened, his face paling as he realized the tide had turned. His hand loosened but didn't release, as if he could still claw back control. The stage was a powder keg, and Harrison, standing firm, had just struck the match that set the audience ablaze. Can a man's pride survive when a room turns against him? The Hollywood Spotlight studio pulsed with the chant of "Harrison, Harrison!" as the audience, now a force of its own, drowned out the chaos on stage. Clint Eastwood, his hand still lingering on Harrison Ford's arm, looked like a general who'd lost his army. His grip slackened, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, as the crowd's cheers for his rival stung like 1,000 cuts. Harrison stood steady, his eyes never leaving Clint's, a quiet strength radiating from him. Jack Reynolds, the host, hovered uselessly, his pleas for calm swallowed by the uproar. The cameras, unyielding, captured every flinch, every glare, for a world watching live. Clint, desperate to claw back his dominance, released Harrison's arm and stepped back, his voice booming over the chants. He called the audience fools, blinded by a has-been sob story. He sneered at Harrison, saying he was nothing without the roles others handed him, a drifter who'd begged for scraps in Hollywood's gutters. His words were acid, meant to burn, accusing Harrison of riding coattails while Clint built empires. He pointed at the crowd, saying they'd regret cheering for a man who'd never match his legacy. The boos that followed were deafening, but Clint stood taller, as if their anger fueled him. Harrison didn't shout back. Instead, he turned to the audience, his voice soft but clear, cutting through the noise like a lighthouse in a storm. He told a story, one he'd rarely shared, about the years after Clint's betrayal. He spoke of nights spent fixing furniture to pay rent, of auditions where he was laughed out the door, of a wife and kids who believed in him when he doubted himself. He said every rejection was a brick in the wall he built, not to hide behind, but to stand on. That wall, he said, led to Han Solo, to Indiana Jones, to a life Clint couldn't break. The crowd fell silent, then cheered, some wiping tears, their hearts won by a man who'd fought and won against the odds. Even Jack, the host, was moved, his eyes glistening as he nodded at Harrison. He tried to speak, to bridge the divide, but Clint cut him off, his voice a snarl. He called Harrison's tale pathetic, a cheap trick to milk sympathy from a gullible crowd. The audience roared in protest, their voices a wall of sound. Clint, his face red with rage, turned to leave, stomping, toward the stage's edge. He muttered about not wasting his time on losers, his boots heavy on the polished floor. The crew froze, unsure whether to stop him, while Jack stammered, begging him to stay for the show's sake. But the audience had other plans. As Clint reached the wings, a chant rose, not for Harrison this time, but a demand. "Sit down! Sit down!" It grew louder, relentless, a tide pulling Clint back. Men and women, young and old, stood, their voices united, refusing to let him escape the truth. Clint stopped, his shoulders stiff, caught between his pride and the crowd's will. He turned, his eyes scanning the sea of faces, and saw no allies. Slowly, he walked back, each step a surrender. He sank into his chair, his jaw tight as the audience cheered, not for victory, but for justice. Harrison sat too, calm, his gaze steady while Jack exhaled, wiping his brow. The stage was a battlefield still, but now the fight was on Harrison's terms, with a crowd that wouldn't let Clint run from his reckoning. What does it take to topple a giant and still stand tall? The Hollywood spotlight stage, alive with the audience's unyielding spirit, held Clint Eastwood captive in his velvet chair. His scowl was a fortress, but cracks showed in his eyes, where defiance wrestled with defeat. Harrison Ford, seated across from him, carried the calm of a man who'd faced worse storms and come out stronger. The crowd, their voices still echoing from their chant to keep Clint from fleeing, watched with bated breath. Jack Reynolds, the host, sat rigid, his hands clasped, sensing the moment could make or break the night. The cameras zoomed in, framing. Two legends in a showdown that felt bigger than the stage itself. Harrison rose, not to intimidate, but to speak from the heart. His voice was warm, steady, like a fire that comforts rather than burns. He said Hollywood wasn't built by men who stepped on others, but by those who lifted them up. He looked at Clint, not with anger, but with pity, saying his legacy was tarnished, not by failure, but by cruelty. He spoke of the actors, the grips, the dreamers Clint had dismissed, their names forgotten but their scars real. Harrison's words turned to resilience, to the power of standing up after being knocked down, of proving worth through work, not betrayal. He said he didn't need Clint's apology, because his life, his family, his fans were proof he'd won long ago. The audience clapped, their applause a rolling thunder, some standing, their faces lit with pride for a man who spoke their own struggles. Clint shifted, his hands gripping the armrests, his face a storm of emotions. The crowd's cheers for Harrison were a mirror, reflecting his own flaws back at him. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if the words he wanted wouldn't come. The audience, sensing weakness, began to chant again, not Harrison's name. This time, but a simple demand. Say it! Say it! They wanted truth, an admission, something to balance the scales. Jack leaned forward, his voice gentle, urging Clint to speak, to end the night with dignity. The pressure was a tide, and Clint, for all his stubbornness, couldn't swim against it. Finally, Clint spoke, his voice low, rough, like gravel underfoot. He said he didn't owe anyone anything, but if Harrison needed to hear it, he was sorry for how things went back then. It wasn't heartfelt, more a grunt than a confession, but it was enough. The crowd murmured, some clapping, others nodding, accepting the grudging words as a crack in Clint's armor. Harrison didn't gloat. He nodded, his eyes meeting Clint's, and said he accepted, not for himself, but for everyone Clint had wronged. He extended a hand, not in friendship, but in closure. Clint hesitated, then took it, their handshake brief, heavy with history. The audience roared. Their applause a wave that lifted the room, celebrating not just Harrison, but the idea that truth could still matter. Jack, seizing the moment, stood, thanking both men for their honesty, his voice cracking with relief. He turned to the crowd, calling them the real stars, and they cheered louder, their unity a testament to the night's raw power. Harrison sat, a small smile breaking through, while Clint stared ahead, his silence louder than any words. The cameras panned out, capturing the stage, the crowd, the moment where a feud ended, not in fire, but in hard-won peace. The show closed with music swelling, but the real melody was the audience's joy, a sound that promised this night would be remembered, not for a strike, but for a man who stood up, spoke truth, and showed the world what strength really means.